Welcome to Et al., a podcast from Baylor University Press, where we interview authors and publishing experts to bring you the best scholarship in the fields of scriptural, historical, and theological studies, as well as the world of academic publishing. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome, everyone, to Et al., a podcast of Baylor University Press. I am very privileged to be joined today by Maayan Raveh. She is the author of the forthcoming Under the Olive Tree, Palestinian Christian Theology from the 1980s to the present. Maayan, welcome to the podcast. It's a real joy to have you here today.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm really thrilled to be here.
Yeah. So Maayan is the academic director at the Haifa Laboratory for Religious Studies at the University of Haifa in Israel. Her work focuses on the intersection of theology and peace building and interreligious dialogue, particularly in conflict zones. She completed her PhD in comparative religion at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where her award-winning dissertation explored Christian theological perspectives on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In addition to her academic pursuits, Dr. Raveh is deeply engaged in interfaith initiatives, fostering dialogue and understanding across diverse religious communities in the Middle East. Now, we are here today to talk about her new book on Palestinian Christian theology, and I would just like to acknowledge at the beginning of this that the people we'll be discussing are currently experiencing enormous suffering and loss. And as we discuss Palestinian Christian theology, it's important to remember the tragic war currently claiming thousands of lives. So while our conversation today may at times feel academic, it is rooted in the experiences of suffering happening today.
I can add, it's not easy to be an Israeli writing on Palestinian Christian theology. And I did try to do whatever I can to be as much academic, but also objective about the subject. And I do think that I'm managing many places, but I did wrote this book from this meeting point between religion and conflict as a person who is unwillingly is part of conflict. And so the war is not just something that we remember for us, both in Israel and Palestine. The war is something that we live every day. And I think that talking about Palestinian theology, talking about political theology and the conflict, it's exactly what we need to do, to hear as many voices from many different communities, hopefully that together we can find something to work together for a better future.
Yeah, absolutely. I know when I first came across your book as it was presented in a meeting here at Baylor Press, that was before the war had really ratcheted it into the current kind of high gear that it's in. And I don't think any of us could have predicted how prescient and important this work was going to be. So I think, as tragic as it is, the timing for a book outlining Palestinian Christian theology is really important. So thank you for the work that you have done. Now, the subtitle of your book is Palestinian Christian Theology from the 1980s to the present. And I would imagine that some of our listeners know very little about Palestinian Christianity. I know that growing up in the U.S., I heard very little about it. And it wasn't until I was an adult that I really came to understand the dynamics of the Palestinian Christian communities, the diversity represented there. So could you tell us a little bit about Palestinian Christianity? What kinds of Christians live in Palestine? What's their history there? What are the dynamics of those communities?
So, many times when I talk about Palestinian Christians, both to people within Israel and with colleagues abroad, many people ask me, so when I ask them, where do you think those Christians came? Many will say, well, I guess that they were converted, in the 19th century. Which is very reasonable because really in the 19th century, a lot of different mission organizations, both Catholic and Protestant, came to the area. But the truth is that the local Christian communities are here since the time of Christ. We have always had Christian population in the Holy Land. In the beginning, I'm not sure that we could separate them from the from different Jewish communities. But definitely from the 1st century, when the Roman Empire became a Christian empire, then the population here became a Christian population. From the 6th century, most of the people in the region are Christian. And even after the Muslim conquered and after we have a new Muslim empire in the area, only in the 12th century did the majority of the land was Muslim and not Christian. So we have records of the Christian communities all the way until the 1890s and to the present day, where the biggest change happened really in the 19th century, where the local Christian community, which was mostly part of the Greek Orthodox and some from the Eastern churches, started to convert to different kind of denomination, mostly Catholic and Protestant. And that happened because mission organization who came to the Holy Land hoping to convert Jews or Muslim didn't really succeed. So they moved the next other that they could find, and this was the local Orthodox communities. So until the 19th century, we could talk about the majority of Greek Orthodox believers community. And then from the 19th century, we are talking about something like 40% Orthodox, 40% Greek Catholic, and 30% Latin Catholic. And we have few also Protestant communities. I will say in thinking about numbers, we are talking about 180,000 Arab Christian living in the Holy Land, both Israel and Palestinian Authority, where the number had increased sincerely after 1948, and also due to immigration and other things in the area. And I will also add that the question of how do we call the local communities, the indigenous Christian communities, is also very complicated. We can refer to them as Arab Christian, but some see themselves as Aramaic. I talked about Palestinian Christianity, but I do understand, and we should know that there are other Christian communities who doesn't see themselves as Palestinians, but as Israelis or as other kind of nationalities. And that's why I only refer to theologians who see themselves as part of the Palestinian people.
Yeah. So your book is specifically focused on theologians who self-identify, who understand themselves as being Palestinian in identity. And that question of identity, as you've just outlined for us, is very complicated. There's so many different ways that one could understand oneself in that context. And so your book is really trying to tease out that relationship between theology and identity. Could you talk a little bit about how that works? How are these Palestinian Christian theologians really constructing or discovering an identity for themselves?
So the thing that I was focusing on, and I think that I was most interested on, is the role of theologian in defining identity, national identity or political identity, but also religious identity, which I think is so important in the context of the Israel-Palestinian conflict. And so the first thing that I think about identity is upon which group do you define your identity? So the first thing that you do is ask, who is your other? Because our identity will always be in comparison to someone else. For the Palestinian Christian, in the context of the conflicts, they have three different others that they need to define their own identity, because they are part of three different majority groups. So first of all is they're part of global Christianity, and they want to be part of global Christianity discourse about the conflict. In that way, them being part of global Christianity means that they need to understand their place and their identity in global Christianity in relation to the way global Christianity understands Judaism and the State of Israel. The second group will be Muslims, Palestinian Muslims. The Palestinian people who they are part of, and the way they understand their own identity in a very changing atmosphere, because we can see from the 70s and 80s that the Palestinian Muslim society become more and more religious, and we see the rising of Islamic movement that really affect the way Palestinians themselves identify what it means to be part of the Palestinian people. And they also translate the terminology into an Islamic terminology. So when we talk about going against Israel or fighting for the Palestinian cause, some of the terminology will change to Islamic terminologies such as jihad where the Palestinian Christian needed to find how they can be part of those people, part of fighting for the cause of the Palestinian people, but keep their own identity as Christian, their own religious identity. And at the same time, we need to remember that for the Palestinian Christian are in a very risky place, because they are not only Christian within a Muslim majority, but we are living in a time where Christian and Islam are seen as such, like we would talk about civilization war. Palestinian Christian seem as minority of Christians within Muslim communities, where also their connection to the West through the churches, through their education in theological schools in the West, many times brought them to bring modern thinking, liberal European or Western thinking to the Middle East. We can see it with George Antonius in Syria, and we can see it also in Palestine. But when the Islamic movement and Islamic thinking and identity becomes stronger, then the idea of Western or Christian thought, political thought, are very scary for the Muslim population. And so they see those Palestinian Christian many times as someone that you are not sure about his belonging. Very much like Jews in Europe for many years.
Yeah, and I remember a passage in your book in one of the early chapters as you're outlining the history where, early on in the development of Palestinian identity, you have a reflection of maybe the broader movements of Arab nationalism, which is a slightly more kind of secular take on what it means to be a member of a particular nation, and then that develops into a far more religious take a little bit later, and that kind of becomes much more complicated for Palestinian Christians to navigate, because initially, if it's a nationalism thing, that's a little easier to identify with, but when it becomes religious, that becomes maybe a point of discord with their neighbor that wasn't there originally. Do I understand that correctly?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that it's kind of different logical ways of becoming part of the group, or see yourself as part of the group. So if we're talking about the boundaries of the identity of first of all, of the Arab people as one, as pan-Arab, we are all one because we are Arab. So the boundaries of our identities as seeing ourselves as Arab, speaking the same language, coming from the same history, and religion is not a part of that. So Christians for many years were in leading this kind of pan-Arab understanding and also communist thinking, and brought those ideas into the Middle East. Even later, when you talk about identity of Palestinian, which the main thing is them being a nationality. So the Christian has a good place within, because again, the religion is not a question. But in kind of a mirror to what happened to Israel society, in the 1780, society became more religious, and so their identity, their national identity is more religious, both Israel Jews and Palestinian Muslim. Then I think Christians understood that they are in a very problematic place, because to call for unity in the name of nationality or in the name of ethnicity can mean that they are calling to a secular society, which threaten any kind of religious leadership. In the same time, being part of either, if we're talking about two-state solution, being part a minority in a Jewish state or a minority in a Muslim state will still leave them as a minority. So their place is very complicated within this mix of the conflict.
Yes, my goodness. Very complicated indeed. I mean, so they're attempting to kind of integrate and understand their place within Palestinian population as a whole. And then they're also trying to navigate their relationship to global Christianity, which you mentioned. And then the third thing that your book outlines is they're also trying to navigate Western Christianity's understanding of Judaism and Israel, which is a further dynamic that makes this very complicated. So could you talk a little bit about shifting views in Western Christianity on Judaism and how that has played a role in the identity of Palestinian Christians?
Yeah, sure. And maybe first of all, I will try to show that it's not so complicated, this connection. Because if Palestinian Christians want to find their identity within the Palestinian national identity, then in some cases they need to show how they are a part of fighting for the cause of the Palestinian people, but keeping their own religious identity. And that's what they're doing through their political theology, because their political theology is, in a way, their way to be part of rebellions against occupation, of calling for a Palestinian state. And the reason is that they have a common language with the Western world that the Muslim doesn't have. And at the same time, they can also respond to question about the theological aspect of the state of Israel and the meaning of the election and the promised land that is very important in the discourse about Israel and the conflict and Jewish-Christian relation in our days, which is a big discourse that Palestinian were not part of until now, until Palestinian Christian theologians start to ask, how do we read the Bible from our point of view, and not from a Jewish point of view, but also not from a European point of view or Western point of view, that have their own contextual history of the Holocaust, their own theological need on reconciliation with Judaism. But in the same time, and that is the main argument of Palestinian Christian theologian, is that this need of the Western Christian world after the Holocaust did not take into consideration the implication on the Palestinian people. So they tried to reconcile with Judaism, but in the Palestinian theologian eyes, it was done on behalf of the Palestinian. So when you say that you want to bring back people without a land to a land without people, and which is a very famous Zionist and Christian Zionist saying, then the Palestinian will say, no, even if we are out of Western framing, we are still here. The land has people. And not only does it have people, those people are Christian and have connection to your own history and story.
Yeah. What a difficult place to find oneself to try to understand your own identity in relation to so many cross currents that are very strong. I would imagine swimming that river is difficult. So you mentioned their political theology is how they're navigating it. So they're trying to figure out, where do we fit in all of this? And you're saying that out of that is what emerges this political theology. So what are some of the main tenets of that political theology? What are they articulating, and how are they finding their way through theologically?
So I think that the reason why Palestinian theology developed in the end of the 1980s and the framing of my book is because of a change in global Christianity. So Palestinian theologians did not invent a new kind of way of connecting theology and politics. They used post-colonial theological streams, such as liberation theology and South African theology against apartheid, and they rebuilt their theology on that. That means, first of all, that the reading will be contextual reading of the Bible. The Bible should be seen in this kind of theology as going out from one own living experience of reality. That means that when I read the Bible as a Palestinian, I cannot read it without thinking about the occupation. I cannot read it without thinking about the conflict, and to try and locate myself within my own context. That is really important for the Palestinians. That means that when they read any kind of question about the land, about the promises, they read it as the people who are suffering from these promises and asking, how could it be? This is not the God that we have believed in. And the second thing, which will be the next step, which is very important in post-colonial theology, it's the inner criticism about Christianity. And we talk about the hermeneutic of suspicion. So the question is not, why did God chose the Israeli people over the Palestinian? Because for a Palestinian theologian, as people who believe in God and in Christ, the question is irrelevant. Obviously, God will not choose one people over another. So they rephrase the question is, why did we believe, or others believe, that God chose the Jewish people and the state of Israel over us? And that becomes the main question. It's not the problem with the support of the state of Israel as much as the support of the policy of the state of Israel, or the silence of the European or Western world, which changed, I think, during the last war, but for so many years when the churches have said nothing. And saying nothing, it's for both sides. So the Catholic Church had, in one of her declarations, said that the state of Israel should be related as a political regime and not something theological. But in the same time, they did not say what is the meaning for the Catholic Church. For other Protestant church, not only what is the meaning of the election and the promise of the Jewish people, and what that was declared in Nostra Aetate in 1965, that the gift and the promise are irrecoverable. But then we ask, or the Palestinian will ask, you cannot live it in this kind of amorphical understanding of relation between Jewish and Christian when there are political implications.
Yeah. So the Palestinian Christian is going to feel the very tangible consequences of those decisions for them and for their families in a way that maybe the Western theologian who's thinking about this slightly more abstractly is maybe not going to perceive. Is that accurate?
Yeah, more so that still, and we can see it in theology written in Europe, the Holocaust is still very visible in the theology. And the question of anti-Semitic is very visible. And I think it should be, because it's still a very important issue. But then the Palestinians will say, we have to in some way separate the political question of the state of Israel, or the state of Israel in general, from biblical Israel. We cannot get legitimacy for political power based on a Bible who belongs to all.
Yeah. So let's dive into that a little bit, because the question of the reading of the Bible in this context is so paramount for so many of the actors involved. So how do you differentiate between reading the Bible as scripture, between the Israel of the Hebrew Bible or the Christian Old Testament, and the Israel of the state today? How do you see Palestinian theologians navigating those differences?
So that's a great question, which I think it's touching the most important place where you can see how, in one hand, post-colonial theologies and post-Holocaust theologies in somewhere clashes together. So we're talking about two kinds of a theological movement who ask to talk about political reality as part of their theology, to talk about eschatological thinking of, well, the end is a place of hope for better life for everybody, for all oppressed groups. And the way to allow this kind of voices, the way to widen the frame of global Christianity was in different way of inclusion different groups after World War II. So first of all, we have the trying to inclusion of the global South. We have different way to refer to the majority of Christianity nowadays, but they are not part of the history and tradition of Western Christianity. And in some way, they are not part of the history of the church. They are newcomers. So the question was, how do we bring them in to be part of and to feel part of the global Christian world? And that was being done by allowing them to have a contextual theology. That means that many of them, that's allowing them, but also they demanded in liberation theology to come and read the Bible from their own perspective, not from Western reading. In order to do that, you need to think about the Bible as a story of faith, as an ahistorical narrative that you can find yourself and find your hope within it. That means that when people from South America read the Bible and read the Exodus stories, they will think in liberation theology that as God liberates the people of Israel from Egypt, so he will do to the poor and oppressed in South America. So that will be a contextual reading of the Bible.
Yeah.
And when we are doing contextual reading of the Bible, each one can read it the same passages from different contexts. But when Palestinians will try and read the story of the Exodus, they have a problem, because their enemy or the people they are object to use the same story. But not only that they use the same story, the state of Israel, the Jewish people use the Exodus. In some way, after rejecting replacement theology and supersessionism, the global church, both Protestant and Catholic Church, brought back Judaism into salvation history. So for many centuries, Judaism has been seen as something that we need to forget, or we need them to witness the victory of Christianity, but they don't have anything to add for us. After the Holocaust, and with trying to reconciliation with Judaism, this idea had changed. So now we are talking about Judaism as the elder brother of Christianity, the people who keep in them the history of Christianity. So when Palestinian Christian read the Exodus and talk about the way God had liberated the people of Israel from Egypt, then how can we do it when the story of the Exodus is so much part of Israeli identity, of Jewish Israeli identity? You know, the sheep who came from Europe in 1945, just after the war, was called Exodus. It's part of the idea that the state of Israel is the new Exodus. But now here is the problem, is the historical story of the Jewish people. And then they have kind of a monopoly over the historical meaning of it. Or is it an ahistorical story that everybody can relate from different places? But no matter what you choose, you will have to disinclude one group. So either it's an ahistorical story, and then Judaism doesn't have a place within Christian theology, which happened before, and it was declared as anti-Semitism. And on the other hand, you can talk about Judaism as part of Christian history, but then what do you do with groups who aren't part? Are Judaism more important from other groups, from South America? And that's what the Palestinian will ask. Where are we fit in? But for the Palestinians are not newcomers.
Yeah. So you describe it in your book. The chapter title is Betwixt and Between, so on one hand, this post-colonial theology where these previously neglected voices are finding a voice and are beginning to articulate theology within their own contexts. And then you have a post-Holocaust theology on the other side, which is attempting to eradicate these anti-Semitic tendencies or strands within Christian theology. And some would say that are at the very foundation of Christian theology, are trying to reconstruct a non-supersessionist or non-anti-Semitic Christian theology. And these Palestinian Christians find them kind of stuck in the middle, right? Because
and I think that you'll see in many cases, and I heard from many colleagues in Europe and in the States, that not only the Palestinian Christians are stuck in the middle, but many Christian believers who don't know how they relate to the state of Israel, because there is a question of what is the connection of the state of Israel to biblical Israel. There is a question of the Jews as either the other, but also as people who keep history. And in the same time, global Christianity has been going in a direction of justice, universality, and all kind of post-colonial thinking. And with the previous Pope, Franciscus, it was very clear that this is the direction now we are taking. And so I think that many people, and maybe in Germany, you can see it most obviously, don't know what to do with the conflict, of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I'm trying to show a little bit in the book the different way people relate to the conflict, to a political issue, in order to understand their own theology and their place within this kind of theology. Because as I see any Christian believers talking about the conflict, will always have some theological thinking behind his political opinion, because Israel is the Holy Land, no matter what.
Yeah. Yeah. So in some ways, these political conflicts are forcing maybe too strong of a word, but they're helping to maybe catalyze theological thinking on these topics, that you really can't separate these two things, the politics from the theology.
Yeah, so I don't think that they encourage it. I think that they allow it to reappear, because religion, politics, and theology were always, as one. And what we have seen in the Western society mostly after Luther, that we separate between church and state in a more dramatic way. And after World War II, that was changed in global Christianity after Moltmann and Metz and the horrible implication of the war. Global Christianity had changed itself. And that's what we see here.
So as we're looking at Palestinian Christian theology in particular, as a response to being in the middle of these very large, significant forces, what is the distinct offering that it provides? What are some of the key things that Palestinian theologians are saying that you think that Palestinian theologians would want those in the rest of Christian theology to hear?
So I think that the main issue that they are raising is not so much to solve the question of Judaism or the conflict, but demanding global Christianity to think theologically about the conflict. And, in many cases, I think the Jewish-Christian relation and question of anti-Semitism had become something like a scary pond that we don't want to go near to. So we are circling it all the time. But that means that we also don't relate to the implication for the Palestinian people. So in many cases, I think that what the Palestinian people demand is to reopen those questions and understand that there are political implications. And after that, to help them think how they can find their own hope for better life. And, in that sense, I'm having the same call as an Israeli, hoping that with a theological thinking, with thinking together with global Christianity, and hopefully later with global Judaism and Islam, we can find a theological way of understanding the conflict and also maybe go for another step.
Yeah. So avoiding the theological question is not the answer, is what you're saying, that we have to engage it as directly as possible.
And more so, what the Palestinian will say that the avoiding of many in the global Christianity had helped other radicals to weaponize the Bible, which is very important. So when we avoid talking about connection between politics and theology, we leave the state open to the radical people who doesn't have a problem to talk about their own political theology.
Yeah. Well, I think that is a fantastic way of underscoring the importance of your own work in unearthing and summarizing and helping the rest of us who are not as engaged to understand what Palestinian Christian theologians are saying as a way of helping us engage the questions directly and have those conversations in a straightforward way. So thank you so much for this work and for the beautiful book that you've written. It is coming out this fall with Baylor University Press. You can pre-order it today at baylorpress.com. And thank you so much for talking to us today about your upcoming book.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Et Al, a podcast from Baylor University Press. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to keep up with the latest from Et Al.